Denise Roza, welcome to the Trips and Global on Wheels podcast hour.
Well, welcome, or thank you very much for inviting me to be one of your guests.
Of course, we are so delighted to have you today. So, just to give listeners a background of you, Denise Roza grew up in Chicago and began studying Russian in college. In 1989, she traveled to Moscow to coordinate student exchange programs and has been living in Russia since. In 1997, together with Russian colleagues from the disability rights movement, Denise set up a Russian disability NGO, Perspektiva, to support people with disabilities to lead full, active, and independent lives. As Executive Director of Perspektiva, Denise oversees the development and implementation of programs which promote youth empowerment, equal access to education, employment, and sports. So, welcome, Denise.
Thank you.
I know you love living in Russia and felt comfortable there, you know, from the first time you were there in 1984, I believe. What do you like about the Russian culture, and why do you think you were able to bond so quickly to the Russian people?
Well, I think that's always, a hard question to answer. Why did I feel so comfortable? I don't know, but I did. I felt comfortable. I felt at home as soon as I came here. I enjoyed being here. I liked the people. I still like the people. People are very hospitable, very warm, very emotional. Maybe that's what I like too. I'm kind of an emotional. I've got lots of emotions. Um, and and so I just enjoyed being here, and I felt, as I said, I felt very welcome from day I came here in 1984. At that time, it was still the Soviet Union, and then people were very curious and wanting to know more about America and about life in America. And I just think I liked. Well, I just kind of bonded quickly with people. So I don't, it's kind of hard to explain. Of course, I'd studied Russian, so I was anxious to improve my Russian, but I just felt really accepted very quickly. And it's kind of, as I said, I don't know how to explain it, but all I know is when I left in 1984, then I knew I was coming back.
I think some feelings, as you were saying earlier, are just hard to explain. You feel something and it's hard to explain why or what you like about it. So, my next question is, where does your passion for wanting to help Russian people with disabilities come from? What inspired your drive to improve the lives of individuals with disabilities in Russia?
Well, I think that when I started years ago, I was working. First, I worked for a student exchange program, which I really liked doing. And then this when I came back in 1989. And then I was not, when I came back in 89, it's not like I planned to stay for the next, how many years is it now? It's 30 years or is 20 years? Whatever, it's 30
Mm-hmm.
years. It's a long time. It was like I really planned, it's like, oh, I'm going to be here in 30 years. No, of course not. But I was working on, like, I was the resident director of a student group, and I kept getting new student groups. And at one point I was like, oh, I need to do something different. And I worked in a company here, and business was just starting. And there was no business environment here. And I thought, when I did that for about a year, and I knew that is, it was enough for a year for me to understand that that's not the way I wanted to spend the rest of my life. That I really wanted to be in a different area, either helping people or making, see, I wanted to be able to see changes. I saw people that needed, I don't like the word help, but kind of to help people be part of society, kind of to support people. And I think I've always felt that drive within me. And so that's something I decided I wanted to look for something else. So I started looking for a job. Nonprofits were very new. This was 1994. And so that was the nonprofit sector it didn't exist before. It didn't exist. It started, um, nonprofits started developing in like 1989, 1990, slowly. And and I was lucky to find out about an organization, the World Institute on Disability, a nonprofit, a U.S. based in Berkeley at that time. I think they're now in. Oh no, they were based in Oakland. Now I think they're in Berkeley. And they were looking for someone to head up their programs. They had just started running some programs with a local nonprofit that had only been around for a couple of years, a disability organization, the Albertson Society of Disabled People, and they needed someone to like be the head of their office, or lead their office and be the director, the local one. And I had an interview with a guy called Bruce Curtis, and Bruce then hired me for the job, and he became both my a friend and a mentor. He was my boss, and Suzanne Rear, someone else, was a boss. But so that I was pulled into this. I mean, I when I saw the job description, I thought this would be interesting for me. I want to try this. I want to apply for this job.
So you wrote that, and you also shared just now that, people with disabilities have become more visible, um, and face less stigma, get a better education, go to public events, speak out on social media, and are generally becoming active participants in society. But they're still fighting negative attitudes, myths, and the lack of sufficient services. So, what are your plans to overcome these challenges?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what we're doing now, and there still are challenges. But as I said, attitudes, especially, we've seen huge changes in attitudes on the part of people, just regular people who who previously had little or no contact with people with disabilities. I mean, I think that was a big problem, that people just didn't see or meet people with disabilities. I used to ask people, that used to be a question I would ask people. Sometimes I still do. I'd say, so how many people with disabilities do you know? And they might name a few people. I said, but have you ever really talked to them or met with them, or you just kind of know them from afar? And most people had never really sat down with a person with a disability and talked to them, and they knew very little about them. So I think that was one of the problems with the barriers, this exposure, this opportunity to meet with people. Of course, and that's a problem of accessibility as well, but it's a problem of people not being at the workplace, not being in schools. So that's something years ago, we began to realize, we started working with young people. So it was this empowerment program for young people with disabilities. And of course, we slowly realized that young people were getting a really not a very good education. And many of them not only were they not getting a good education, but they were not included. So either they were getting education in special schools, or they were getting education at home on the homeschool program, or some people weren't getting any education. So that became one of our priorities, education and inclusive education. Another priority slowly became employment, because we realized that, okay, education, yeah, if you start getting an education, what's the next step? Employment. And we saw very few people, if anybody. I mean, young people, you never saw people going to the university. That was always a challenge, and then going off to get a job. Um, and we've also leadership. So we've continued to do a leadership program. So we have a program to promote inclusive education. We work with a lot of schools. We work with parents. We provide training for teachers. We go into schools and we do a lot of disability awareness training and activities to raise awareness um, about the necessity to really promote inclusive education, and why inclusive education is, can be a very positive experience for everyone. And so we talk about that, and we with the teachers, etc. And there is legislation now supporting inclusive education, which wasn't there, which didn't exist years ago. So we have that program. We also have this program, a leadership program, where we work with youth. So we work with teens and young people, and the goal is really to provide them with new, kind of with the skills, but also we want to help young people and teens understand that they have a huge potential. They can do a lot. They can speak up for their rights, but they need to, we help them become more self-assured. And the programs are being run by people with disabilities themselves. So it'll be, I mean, it's kind of peer support, but it's more bringing together people in the disability community to do trainings for them. We'll bring people of us successfully in jobs to come and make presentations for youth with disabilities. So everything, we also have a theater program. So we have young people who will be writing their own plays about the lives, well, not necessarily about their lives, but they will, it's about the lives of people around them. It's about their own experiences. And then we have professional actors performing, and then we have our young people with disabilities also performing in some of these plays. So it's all about, so that's all, that's part of our leadership program. And with our leadership program, we're also looking at potential job opportunities for people with disabilities.
Yeah, it sounds like it's very multifaceted, all with all that you guys do under Perspectiva and then all the programs. I think I was reading one of the PowerPoints for your trainings in the elementary schools. I think those are really powerful, and your photography programs and
Hmm.
imaging and perceptions of individuals with disabilities. I think exposure is very, very important. I think having someone who's passionate about this topic and this issue and who's willing to stick with it long term, that's the key, and to see the progress of it. I think it's because people like you who are willing to stay for the long haul that we've seen the progress that we've seen today. So I know in May of 2012, Russia ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which you did a lot of work in this area pushing for it. So how has this, this ratification changed the lives of people with disabilities in tangible ways today?
Well, I mean, it has changed the legislation significantly. And now, as I said, like inclusive education was not part of the legislation. There was talk, the legislation referred to education for children with disabilities. And now, fortunately, in part because of the convention, and whenever we had discussions with different officials, we would always mention that. We would, remind them that, oh yes, the convention has been passed and ratified, and therefore inclusive education must be part of the legislation. I mean, now I think it's taken for granted. The word inclusion, I'm telling you, the word inclusion, we started using it years ago. I mean, not in the very beginning, but years ago. And now it's a very popular word. I think most people understand it. Years ago, people used to tell us, oh, can't you come up with another word that's more Russian? And now everybody uses it. So, and it's, as I said, because of the convention, it also became part of legislation. Legislation has changed significantly to reflect the different articles in the convention, and I think that's very important. And I think the cities in general, cities have become more accessible. There's still a lot, to be done. Um, Changes have made, a lot of changes have been made in the way of education, and a lot is happening in the way of education for not only for uh, whatever children, high school and grammar school kids, but also for university students, providing support for university students or for students to study with disabilities to study at the universities. And that's, I mean, as I said, it's still, we're talking about slow. I mean, things have been happening very quickly, but there's still, of course, a lot to be done. But we see a lot of changes, transportation becoming more accessible, in part because the legislation now requires that transportation be accessible. Um, Universities have to be accessible. Of course, not all the universities are perfectly accessible, but at least they're beginning to. I mean, I think the awareness has helped the awareness change, because now they understand that some of the buildings, at least some of the buildings, need to be accessible. They have to provide some of the training or the for students in an accessible building. I mean, as I said, like that we have, I know a young man who uses a wheelchair, and he is an IT major, and he has been having problems because he can't. It's hard for him to get to travel to the university, and there are no good courses, distance learning courses, IT courses. So I mean, I think there still has a lot needs to be done. But because of the convention first has started to raise awareness.
Yeah, I think what the convention did, while you were talking, I was thinking it pushed the start button
Mhm.
to allow for progress, basically. So I see that you not only, as you were talking about earlier, you have people all over the world. You're collaborating with people from various countries outside of Russia. So not and you have disabled individuals on your team as well. How has this diverse and cross-cultural collaboration process pushed the disability rights movement forward in Russia?
Well, I mean, I in the very beginning, I mentioned an example which I think was important. It's when my colleagues, this was years ago, so 1990, whatever, 5 or 96, when people with disabilities from the disability movement in the U.S., came to Russia to, talk about their experiences, to, in the social model of disability and do training. Uh, Most people were very surprised that it was people with disabilities coming to do the training for them. And over the course of the project, we could see how the people, local people with disabilities, began to see themselves differently because they began to realize that they could be advocates, they could speak up for their rights, that people would listen if they would talk about their issues and the kinds of changes that need to be made. So I think it was very empowering for them to meet with other people with disabilities who had already gone through that process, who had already been, had made changes in their own countries, and to talk about the changes they had made. So, I mean, that's just one example. Um, I mean, I think, like as I said, we recently had someone from Scotland come. Oh, no, wait. Yeah, but you talked about the experiences with employment, a person with intellectual disabilities. I mean, I think that was great. He could share his experiences, and that was useful. But I was just thinking about someone who came from Ireland, a guy with an intellectual disability, and met with some local people and met with some of our volunteers and staff and talked about his experiences as a person with intellectual disability. He lived in an institution and how he was living independently now. And I think that all of those, I mean, I could probably come up with hundreds of examples, but of course we don't have time to listen to them, of people who have traveled to Richard Reiser, someone, a guy from the UK, who is also a wheelchair user and who has done a lot. He's a member, he's a leader in the disability movement there, and who also came to share his experiences, but really to promote inclusive education because that is one of his main topics. And he met with teachers, he met with people with disabilities because what we did, one of our goals has always been to train people with disabilities to do their own, to go out there and make their own changes in their communities and to do their own changes or whatever their trainings for teachers or whatever to do, speaking about the different issues and why, and talk about arguments and talk about values and things that you're not ready to do. And he would come and say, this is okay, look at this is the different model of social model of disability and the cultural model, whatever, and then talk about how he did it and talk about how he worked with the teachers in the UK to change their attitudes, a person with a disability coming to the classroom, because we've been doing disability awareness training for years, but that's kind of a different level. That's really changing the attitudes of kids, but kind of bringing disability into the schools so that it's not taboo. It's part of life, people with disabilities, wanting to be just part of the community and be at the schools, etc. But he was talking more about inclusive education. So it's been, I mean, over the years, it's been a long time, more than 20 years, having people, different people, sports. We had people come over, Paralympic athletes coming over. I mean, we didn't. They might have been invited by the U.S. Embassy or by some other embassy or the UK Embassy, and we would have this opportunity to meet with them. So they would meet with other athletes here, or they would meet with teachers, and then they would talk about their own experiences. So it was always, this kind of sharing. And as you said, how has that changed the situation in Russia? I think that, I mean, I can't say that's made like, any huge changes, but I'm certain that it has changed the way people think. It's changed attitudes, but it's given people a different vision. It's
Yeah, I think those kind of impacts are hard to measure, but certainly at the attitudinal level and spiritual level, you can see the changes there, and that translates to more
and we've
physical
had
changes, rather
yeah,
that be infrastructure or policies.
yeah, and we've had the opportunity to send people to other countries. Sometimes it was like a grant, not our funding, but people said "Oh, we want to do this program for teachers or disabled activists," and we'll say, "Oh," and so we put together a group from different cities, and then they go to the other country, and sometimes we are able to make recommendations on what to see, and that's been really wonderful. So people come back and say, "Oh my good," they see something that they didn't imagine.
Exactly. I think
Now,
this transitions well onto and then how disability is represented in the media. So as you were, alluding to earlier, in 2002 you founded the International Disability film festival, breaking down barriers. So, why is it so important that persons with disabilities are portrayed in film?
Well, first of all, people like film. I mean, film is one of those things, and of course, there are different kinds of film. You've got feature films, you've got documentary films, you have animation, all kinds of films, short films, long. But I think most people like to go to the movies and like to watch films, and it's an easy medium. I mean, it's. I mean, for I think when we started doing it, well, I think first of all, we we became convinced because we started using films in our raising awareness activities. And maybe when we started using films, we didn't know that the films were going to have such an impact on people. But then we started using them, and we thought, oh wow, this is amazing, because it really films, they touch you, they move you emotionally. Films make you think about certain issues that you might not have thought about. And so we had people talking about things they had never talked about. We had people seeing we started with films that we brought over from the US. We translated them, started showing them to people with disabilities here, and talking about how people in the US live. This was 2000, this was like 1999 or something. I know some of the first films we showed, maybe 1998. And we saw how powerful these films were and how people reacted to them. And these were people both in the disability community. These are people outside. I mean, these are people maybe like professionals. And I think then we became convinced that we needed to use film more in our work. Of course, I don't think we were thinking necessarily about a film festival, but we surely realized how powerful film could be to maybe, I mean, maybe changing attitudes. Maybe it doesn't really change attitudes, but it surely makes you think about an issue differently. It's a great way to educate people about certain things. I mean, if it's a documentary film, wonderful way to educate people about different issues from all over the world. I mean, things that they hadn't thought about. And here it is. You could think about it. You could talk about it. And it's a great tool for discussing too, because we'd never just show a film. We'd show a film and then talk about it. Um, and it gives role model. I mean, you've got role models in that film. You have attitudes, issues, new technologies. I mean, think of all the things that you could see in a film. It's not like we didn't show films about new technologies. That's not as exciting. But when you show films about people using those new technologies, that's exciting. So I think that we realized that film could just film was amazing and could be so powerful as a tool to change attitudes or to educate people. And there's so many amazing films like Anti-Giant or Stanley by Stanley, an amazing film. These are short films. Stanley by Stanley, Polish film, or Hero Brother. I mean, like Stanley by Stanley is a guy who has, talks about um, how he has no arms, and he meets this kid. So they introduce him to a kid who has no arms, and he is a role model for this kid, and he becomes friends with this kid, and he becomes a mentor. And it's an amazing film about sharing about how this kid, who's only 4 years old, suddenly realized that I can be independent. I can be like this guy who is doing so much, driving a car, living. He's got a wife, he's got a family. He's a great guy, and I can be like him. Um, or Anti-Giant, and it's a guy who is a Canadian guy who's a wheelchair user, and he's a comedian. He's an amazing comedian, and it's about his life. Or Hero Brother is a film. It's an Israeli film, and it's about this. They decided to make this film. It's you see families of people. It's a brother and sister, a brother without a disability, a sister with Down syndrome, or a brother with Down syndrome and a brother without a disability. I mean, so siblings and the experiences they have, and they go into the mountains. They go for a trip, a hike into the mountains together. And it's really interesting to see how their communication and remembering their childhood and kinds of issues that they faced as kids, and siblings who have a sibling without a disability and with a disability. So that was an amazing film. But I can tell you, I mean, we've had that, just all of our films are amazing.
How can we empower more people with disabilities to want to be in film, theater, and the rest of the performing arts arena in Russia? And, perhaps doing these things, boosts that as well.
Well, I mean, I think it continued during our running our film festival. Um, we we will continue doing screenings of the festival of the films in Moscow and other cities. I think supporting, for example, we have a theater program as well, and as part of our theater program, we support people with young people with disabilities to be either write plays, to participate in performances, and to somehow, and one of our goals is also to help them participate in different aspects of theater, not only in acting and in writing the plays, so that who knows, maybe in the end, somebody will find a profession in theater, doing something in theater. Um, and to continue. I mean, I don't like film is a little harder, to help someone. I think a person needs to get an education. So I think that one of our goals is also to continually promote access to education. Because that's what they should have. People with disabilities need to have the opportunity to go to film schools to get an education. I know there is a film project in Russia now. It's outside the university, but they have some funding to run a film school. And I know that they visited our film festival. But I think it's always by promoting people. I can't say that what we're doing is necessarily promoting people, but I know that we have been always like it, even at our film festival. We had this year and 2 years ago, we had discussions, we had roundtables on the topic of how to help people with disabilities be more involved in uh, the film industry, in theater, in the performing arts, and to be supported instead of having people without disabilities playing these roles, but having people with disabilities. So we've started the discussions, and I don't think, I mean, we're surely nowhere near what's happening see what's happening in the UK and with the US in promoting people with disabilities in these, instead of hiring people without disabilities, people with disabilities in these roles. I mean, I think one issue is getting people in Russia, getting filmmakers to make more films about this issue, disability issues. About heroes, or what, I mean, heroes not the good word, but the main characters, people with disabilities. Um, but I think that what we're doing is, of course we realize that we can't do everything. And we're trying to focus on what we're doing and do it well. So I would say continue with our film festival. But I know that at our film festival and in our rhetoric, we're always talking about the fact that people with disabilities need to be represented. They need to have a voice. They need to be involved as much as possible. Um, and as I said, we're always looking at employment as well. And so us, employment is important. So looking at people with disabilities in different areas, like in the arts as well, but not just as a fun thing, because we know that there are people out there doing theater, but we want them to be able to be out there doing theater and to get paid for it not to just be a hobby, if that's the kind of profession they want to be in. So I mean, I think it's just like always thinking about the different kinds of opportunities we can be developing in the work that we're doing as a disability organization, and also working with our partners and doing the same thing. For example, many of our partners from different cities of Russia come to our film festival. They participate in these different discussions, and they bring back these kinds of ideas to their own cities where they can discuss them as well. And they do, as I said, like our film festival will travel to other cities, and they will be hosting the film festival. Disability groups, disability organizations. It'll be organizations of parents with disabilities as well, working together with local officials, maybe with universities, to present the festival
Hmm.
and to talk about different issues. So I think that's. But we definitely, I mean, I personally think that it's a great. I love seeing this movement in other countries where people with disabilities are saying we need to become, because we want to be, we're professional, we're actors, you need to hire us. And
Hmm.
think that one of
Hmm.
the issues is in Russia today is there aren't very many actors out there who are professional, who have the skills,
So,
but
doing a little comparison, that just because you have such a unique background of being a U.S. citizen and then having lived in Russia for nearly 3 decades now, how is the Russian society's attitude towards people with disabilities different from the U.S. attitude, just from your own, limited viewpoints?
No, I think now the attitudes are very similar. They're changing. If you think about what the attitudes were like 30 years ago, if you can imagine what it was like probably in the 50s, 60s, maybe 70s, um, because people with disabilities were not very visible. Most people with disabilities in the U.S. too were very isolated. That's what the attitudes were like here in the 90s, the 80s. The 80s, I don't even remember seeing very many people with disabilities. And as I said, we're seeing a lot of change now, and attitudes have changed immensely. Um, even with the people we work with the employers or the potential employers. I can remember employers used to always say things like, "Oh, I have the perfect job for that person." It's like, "Oh, what do you mean?" "Oh, it's perfect. It's a desk job. He doesn't have to move very much. He just, he can be at a computer, and he can just be there all day, as if he." And I said, "Well, why do you think that he doesn't want to move very much?" "Well, he's in a wheelchair." I said, "But he's probably faster than you are and more mobile than you are. You just need to make sure the office is accessible." Oh, so little things that people just have these attitudes or that the person, you know, can do or whatever can't do. And I think those, I can't say that they changed totally, but they're definitely changing because people with disabilities are more, they're out there, they're in the community, they're working because we're changing attitudes. Other disability groups are out there because people with disabilities are much more visible. Not only they're visible on the internet, I think the internet has helped make lots of changes in Facebook and in whatever, in Instagram. I've seen more people with disabilities in media, mainstream media. And so that is changing, definitely changing attitudes of people, just, people without disabilities, people just the general attitude in the community. So that's, like I said, we see employers, they change their attitudes, change immensely when they have after they've employed someone with a disability or employed it's actually better after they've employed three people with disabilities because they might employ different people because of course they have these funny perceptions of a person who is deaf, right? And how am I going to communicate with that person? Well, that's impossible. Or this person who has a vision impairment. So, they have these, which are normal. The kinds of, stereotypical attitudes. If you've never met anyone, if you've never really dealt with a person, if you have.
These questions I personally am very curious about because I am, starting a company of my own. It started, I incorporated it recently, but started it a few months ago. So, what are the core principles that you live by that have caused the success of this organization?
Okay, I think one of the core principles for me is um, building a team. I think that from day one, I realized that, well, we had very ambitious goals, but we needed to have a team. And of course, part of the team for us, it was, we had people with disabilities involved, and that was one of our core principles. They have to be not only involved, but be running our programs as well. Be in charge. And we have people with or without disabilities running our programs today, but people with disabilities are making, part of the process, a very important part of the decision-making process and many of our key programs are run by people with disabilities, but having them involved in, from the very start, they were very involved in all of our programs and running and guiding them and developing the programs, etc. So I think that for us as a disability organization, that was one of our key principles, in addition to building a team. And also probably, as a manager, I've always been building on, I think it's always important. Maybe this kind of sounds something like something anybody would be thinking of. You always have to be thinking about the lessons learned and making. Think about make small change too. So you can't go out there. When you go out there, you think, "Oh my God, I want to change the world," but you don't change the world by making. You change the world by making small change. And the small change builds. So it's like little bricks. You're building this wall. It's not a wall you're building, obviously, but you're making change, but you're always reflecting on what you've done and looking at the lessons learned. And I've tried to impact in what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, I'm always
Implement,
trying to not implement. I'm always trying. Uh,
improve.
well, improving, but always talking about this when I'm with my team, our team managers, is that when you're developing your programs, first of all, you always have to look at the people you're developing the programs for and how it's changing their lives, how it's impacting them, improving their lives, etc. But you're always reflecting on what you can do better, how you can improve, what are the lessons, like always doing this kind of an evaluation of what's happening, to make it better, to always, do it better, and getting the team involved in that. I mean, I think that's very important too. Is when your team is you want your team to be involved in that, in these discussions of how to make things improve. And I think also because you're looking at what is happening on the ground, and there are people who are closer to what's really happening, and people who might be a little farther away, and you always want to be listening to what's going on, and using that information to improve what you're doing. So I guess that's important too. But I think, your goals. But I mean, even over the years, our goals have changed slightly. But I think we've expanded our goals. I mean, our goals have always been inclusion, but in the beginning, maybe we're looking more at people with physical disabilities, and we're like, wait, we can't just look at that. We have to expand and look at the lives of all people with disabilities and how we can kind of help them, within the programs we do. Because once you choose your programs, and I think you've got it. That's another thing. You kind of have to realize you can't do everything. So when you have the programs you're doing, working within them, these areas, for example, leadership, you choose the activities you do, looking at the kind of resources you have, the staff you have, and the kinds of changes you want to make, like our empowerment program. I mean, we choose what we want to do, but you can expand. But you always have to look and say, wait a minute, at some point, stop. Do we have the resources to do this? Do we have can we do that well? And then you say, no, let's stop. We want to continue working in this area. I mean, like, we've been doing unemployment. And I think, in our employment program, and we've expanded, continued to work on it, but people have said, oh, why don't you do social entrepreneurship? We're like, well, that's a little different. We're doing inclusive employment. So we've always had to continue to tell ourselves, no, we want to continue doing inclusive employment. It's an important area, and we need to keep improving, because it's not like we're employing thousands and thousands of people, and we can and sharing our experiences. I think that's another important value, is sharing our experiences, with others, so that if they want to do what we're doing, that's great. Supporting other groups to do it. Sometimes we have funding to do that too. So sharing and supporting other groups. I mean, in a big country like Russia, that's important. But the final thing I wanted to say, and you said it at the very beginning, and I thought that was very important. You talked about me doing this, but it's not just me doing it; it's me doing it together with my team. It's starting it, and you really have to continue developing it. It's like the systemic approach. I mean, when you start, you have to keep building on your experiences, growing, developing, and you don't want to give up, because that's when you see the success, or at least.
What are the key ingredients to progress at Perspectiva? So it's a similar question, but now that you have that progress and momentum, how do you keep it going and make it better and better?
Staying on track. I think having what we have more of a collective decision-making process. I think that's important as well. Um, I think it's been important is having, in our situation, I have people who are running each of our programs. So it's people being very involved, and they have teams who are running the programs. And of course, there are people with disabilities in all of these teams. I think that's important for them to be really involved in the decision-making process. Um, I think public education, that's something I didn't mention. We're always working with the media. We work with the social media, et cetera, as well, and raising awareness and educating people about what we're doing, but also about people in our programs and their successes. I think that's also key for our success. One thing I didn't mention, which I think is also very important, is all the partners we work with. So it's partners in different areas. That includes our sponsors. Um, and so working with them um, to really make the change, because I think we see them as true partners in this process of
Mm-hmm.
making changes in the community, and they see us as partners as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that partnership is an important key to making change and to being successful.
Yeah, I think you definitely need to write a book because we didn't even scratch the surface here. And there are many of us who can benefit from your experience in Russia. And yeah, I appreciate you for taking a good chunk of your time out of the end of your day. I know it's late there, for speaking with me, and I've learned so much, and I know that our listeners will learn a lot as well. So thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ming. Bye bye.